George, are you there?
Yes, John, hi.
How are you? George, it's good to hear your voice.
Once again, it's been a long time.
It has been a long time, and I think of you as an oasis of sanity in a crazy world.
Yeah?
So, yeah, we'll get to that later, but first of all,
I'll try
tell
to adopt that stance.
Yeah, I hate to put that responsibility on you. But, so what have you been up to? You're still doing book-related stuff?
Yeah, finally it's basically winding down, but the last thing was a week in the United Kingdom.
Ah,
so,
cool.
Yeah, so that was cool. Right. So this was for the 10 Most Beautiful Experiments, and it was published over there by the Bodley Head. Isn't that a wonderful?
Okay.
Yeah, it's an old British institution. It's an imprint that's been around for I don't know, a century or more. It's all explained on their website, and now it's part of the Random House UK empire.
As everything is these days.
Just about, yeah. So they also have Jonathan Cape, which has published the British editions of my last few books, and the same editor, Will Salkin, is now doing Bodley Head, which is described as seriously good nonfiction. So they only do nonfiction, which is nice.
Well, that sounds like a good description of your work.
Oh, well, thanks. I at least aspired to that. And they had a really good lineup for me. It started out in, there's a bunch of BBC radio interviews. I think I did 3 different ones in the BBC studios up by Oxford Circle. And that was just kind of a trip, getting to go to BBC and see what it was like.
You didn't run into Martin Redfern,
I didn't run into Martin. I was hoping to see him. I did have dinner with Michael Brooks.
He probably told you he's going to be speaking at my school, Stevens Institute,
right.
in November.
Yeah, with his new book. What is it? 13? Wait, I have the galleys here. It's really good. I just read it recently. And yeah, we should mention that Michael Brooks is a former New Scientist editor and now I think consultant, and he was one of the Templeton Science and Religion Fellows with us in Cambridge, England a few years ago. And that Martin Redfern was another one, and he's the science editor, I think his title is, of the BBC. Yeah, here's Michael's book. But yeah, I hear you're going to be doing a Blogging Heads with him?
At some point.
That's good.
So I guess ideally we'll do that right before he comes to Stevens and talks about. So I think the gist of his book is that it's 13 outstanding scientific mysteries.
Yeah, it's 13 things that don't make sense. And you're the perfect foil since you think everything's been figured out and science is done.
Well, not that everything. Well, the big things that we haven't figured out.
Yeah, I know.
And there certainly are some just I think might be too tough to figure out.
Yeah.
What the hell do I know?
But yeah, Michael's doing well, and then I went on to something called the Bristol Festival of Ideas in Bristol.
Oh, that sounds sort of like this.
So I spoke there, and then the best part was something called the Hay Festival. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't.
Well, when they told me, I thought it was going to be like either an agricultural trade show or some kind of druidistic kind of celebration, in which case I thought you might have heard of it. But it turns out that it's the UK's biggest book fair.
Huh.
And it happens in this weird little town called Hay-on-Wye, Wales, which has the largest per capita number of booksellers in the solar system, I think it's safe to say.
And they're not all being put out of business by Amazon.
Yeah, they're almost all used bookstores. It's just this quaint little village that consists mostly of used bookstores. Mm-hmm. But then they set up all these big white tents, and they have this kind of Woodstock of books. And I think they said the first day there was like 40,000 people came.
Wow.
And converged on that. So that was really very fun.
That sounds also very reassuring.
Yeah.
I mean, you keep hearing about the death of books.
I know.
The death of bookstores. So,
yeah, and these weren't like the London literary set kind of people. They just seemed like, people from all over the country who just were in love with books and come to this festival.
Well, good for them.
Yeah, so we may be able to still compete with rock and roll.
Well, let's not get overexcited here.
Yeah, that was basically it. And then in the end, back in London, I gave a talk at the Royal Society for Arts.
Wow, that sounds very impressive.
Yeah, that was very, very British, and it was in this old house, again, some thing that goes back, I think, to the late 18th century, and it was a very, very different audience. But that was fun too. And Simon Singh, the British science writer, he was the MC, which was good to see Simon again.
Oh, so you're trying to bridge the two cultures. So this was an organization coming from the arts.
Yeah, the full title is something like Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacture, and Commerce.
Oh, okay.
Something like that. So.
That's a slightly different connotation.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand it. Apparently Al Gore talked there about global warming at some point.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so this was...
Wow, God, George, that sounds like the publicity machine is really working.
Yeah, they did a really good job there, and it was exhausting. And I only had one day really to myself when I could actually just relax and walk around London, and which is always fun to do. But now I'm back in Santa Fe, and I was reading this morning a piece you just had in the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, a review of a book called Year Million, which is it's a collection of essays by people with really diverse backgrounds in science fiction, economics, medicine, on where humanity, if you can even call it that, will be 1,000,000 years from now. And it actually had a couple of Blogging Heads people as contributors. So Jim Holt wrote one essay,
right,
and Sean Carroll wrote another.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really interesting book, but I ended up finding it somewhat depressing.
Yeah.
Because most of the essays imagined, there's this whole field of scientific speculation. Freeman Dyson is probably the most important figure within it, that imagines how intelligence will evolve in the very far future. So it's related to this idea of the singularity, which I actually talked about last week.
Mm-hmm.
But it's looking way, way beyond the singularity. So if we do become cyborgs or intelligent machines, what are we going to do with ourselves?
Yeah.
That was sort of what I was hoping these people would.
What we do? You mean because it would be just so boring? Because everything would be done for us?
Well, yeah, I guess that did seem to be the problem. So, what a lot of the essays talked about was superintelligent machines basically just existing to make more copies of themselves, and using up all the natural resources, not only in the solar system, but eventually our entire galaxy, and then other galaxies, to make more copies of themselves.
Oh, well, that's basically what we do, right? So,
yeah, right.
So it would just be done on a larger scale.
Yeah, so I would think, being, I don't know, I've got my own utopian vision. I would think, first of all, that we would escape the crazy Darwinian treadmill of just existing to reproduce, which is what a lot of these authors seem to be envisioning.
Yeah.
But then there's the question of...
So this is basically Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, except there weren't a lot of aliens in this.
Oh, but Battlestar Galactica is actually robots that the humans made that basically went off on their own and far surpassed us in technology, or at least in sheer cussedness.
Is that it? And then we end up battling our own offspring?
Yeah, right. But then there's all kinds of interesting subplots where there may be some sort of religious convergence in the works, and as we try to return to Earth. And
yeah, I keep hearing good things about that series.
It's really good, yeah.
But I've never checked it out. Well, maybe some of these authors were influenced by that.
Maybe.
Because a lot of these people were, some of them were scientists, but also wrote science fiction. And then at the end of the piece...
Oh, yeah, like Gregory Benford, right?
Yeah, Gregory Benford. There are some people I hadn't heard of. there's an essay at the very end by a guy named, I think his name is Zembrowski, and then it started getting really depressing. So these were looking beyond the year 1,000,000 toward the point where, because, so we obviously now, we know we live in an open universe. It's not only expanding, the expansion is accelerated. So this was discovered just 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with the prospect of heat death. So that's when basically everything in the universe burns out. But even before that happens, the expansion takes all the other galaxies beyond the horizon. So there are no lights in the sky beyond the Milky Way. Although at some point, I guess the Milky Way will merge with the Andromeda galaxy and a couple of other local galaxies.
Yeah, you had a great description in your review of heat death of the universe. A quote, which is like the most tedious party you ever went to, except much, much worse.
Yeah, right.
An increasingly bland cosmos.
And these guys really rub your face in it. So
I just that's not going to happen though. To me, it's just so far off that it's like worrying about being bored as a protozoan back in pre-Cambrian times or slightly post-Cambrian, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't have taken it so seriously. But they, actually, Jim Holt had one of the most interesting essays in the whole piece, and so he talked about the possibility, which Freeman Dyson and some others have written about, that these superintelligent entities in the distant future, which Dyson and Fred Hoyle think might be basically just clouds of hydrogen and helium and other light elements that are somehow communicating with each other by means of light. And so, what will these things be thinking about? They'll be so intelligent they can think about anything that they like. And Freeman Dyson has suggested that maybe they can think of ever more complicated math problems, which actually really doesn't sound like that much fun. But okay, let's say that is a possibility. And Gödel's theorem implies that math is inexhaustible and we can keep adding new axioms and therefore invent new problems to solve forever.
Yeah.
But Jim Holt, he actually quotes Bertrand Russell toward the end of his career, who decided that mathematics, which had been his great love early on, his great intellectual love when he was a young man, and Russell, toward the end of his career, thought that a really intelligent entity would see mathematics as all this collection of tautology.
Yeah, it's all just one big tautology.
Yeah. That would be fundamentally trivial.
Yeah, it's all just kind of jazz-like riffs on the fact that A equals A.
Right. And so he kind of
I like that. Yeah. So
pretty much then, undermines that.
Yeah.
So then what are we left with? There are two possibilities that the final essay. Let me see if I got his name right. George Zebrowski. He mainly is a science fiction writer, and he basically says that we'll have two options. One is to sort of still deal with reality and hope for new adventures in this increasingly bland, cold universe, and the other is just to create virtual realities and escape the real world within them.
It seems like those would become just as tedious because you could produce any conceivable virtual reality, so there'd be no real surprise, it seems, or challenge.
Yeah, and he actually says at some point that
if mathematics turns out to be one big tautology and people are so smart that it's obvious, then video games are going to just be a subset of that.
Yeah. So
or even
he thinks that the great danger
games.
The great danger will be catastrophic boredom, as he puts it.
That's great.
But then Sean Carroll holds out the possibility that we will be able to, before there's total heat death, we'll be able to create a new universe.
Oh, we want a bubble universe in the laboratory and a baby universe, and it'll spawn off and start all over again?
Right.
And will we occupy that, or will it just start off with a whole new cycle and with new creatures? And
it's not clear.
Yeah.
And Sean also plays with the idea, and this goes back a ways, that our universe was actually created by perhaps another exhausted civilization in a parallel universe somewhere.
Well, it's great science fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just don't see it as any more than that.
Well, so then, what was odd about this assignment from the Wall Street Journal was that it came just as IEEE Spectrum, an engineering magazine, was publishing a whole special issue on the singularity. Which I contributed.
I wasn't really clear on what the singularity was until I read through that issue, and at first I was kind of alarmed that some very very serious publication like this is International, what is it? Electrical Engineers.
The Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which is this magazine is where I started my career about 25 years ago.
Yeah, you first worked there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and as it's a good magazine, very well edited and written and produced. But so it was a little alarming to think that they were doing a whole issue on what sounds to me like this real sci-fi kind of scenario about the singularity. But then I saw that you were in there, so I knew that that there would be a counterweight to really totally over the top speculation. And when I read the articles, in the end I was really impressed with. It gave me a sense of why these people believe this, and seemed to be a good cross-section of opinion.
Yeah, well, the contrast between... So here I just, in this book, Year Million, these people are imagining things a million years from now and beyond, and, you can imagine anything. That's enough time for practically anything to happen. But the hardcore singularity believers think that there are going to be these amazing... almost unimaginable transformations in intelligence within the next 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, I couldn't see anything that I read there that made me remotely optimistic that was the case. But
so you're a skeptic too. I was wondering what you would think, because you've written about artificial intelligence.
Well, some of it to me was just kind of so what else is new? Like I wrote a book. Back in the mid-1980s, over 2 decades ago. God, it's just so horrible to have done things over 2 decades ago. It just makes you feel so old. But it was a book called Machinery of the Mind, Inside the New Science of Artificial Intelligence. And, I went around the country and, talked to Minsky and Douglas Hofstadter and John McCarthy and all of the AI people, Rodney Brooks and some young people that were just kind of coming into their careers and speculated about the same kind of things. This idea that you'd get once you got a machine that was more intelligent than a human being, that you would get this bootstrap phenomenon where the machine would be able to help create even more intelligent machines, and at some point they would just take off on their own. And Edward Fredkin was making the same kind of speculations about that. He said something like, they'll probably get to the point where the machines are so intelligent that they won't be interested in us at all. And if we're lucky, they'll keep us as pets.
Right.
And, this was in 1984, 85, and... now I read this stuff about the singularity, and it's just kind of a word for the same science fiction scenario. But now there seems to be, 2 or 3, very smart people with, who have good, large followings who are taking this seriously, and as a result, it's, been put on the table.
Yeah, I guess. So what I tried to explain in my article was why I'm skeptical from the perspective of neuroscience, and I think that the artificial intelligence people have just always underestimated the complexity of the brain, and so one of the predictions of the singularity people, a fundamental prediction is that computers within the next 15 years or so will surpass the computational power of the human brain.
Yeah.
And so that assumes, it's based on this calculation on the number of neurons, which is about 100 billion, the synaptic connections between neurons, which is roughly 10 to 100,000 per neuron.
Right.
and then the number of action potentials or spikes, these little electrical pulses that are transmitted by synapses every second, and you get something like, I mean, and there's a lot of wiggle room in this, but something like a quadrillion or 10 quadrillion operations per second.
Yeah.
And there are computers now, supercomputers, IBM has one, that's already reached about 3 quadrillion operations per second.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, you can expect that with Moore's Law and all that, that you will very rapidly pass 10 quadrillion operations per second.
Yeah.
But first of all, there's the software problem.
Right. Just having the hardware is not gonna do it.
That's right. And then there's also the question of whether the brain's computational power can really be summed up by action potentials.
Yeah.
So there are some neuroscientists who are coming to think that there are all these computations that are taking place both below and above the level of action potentials. And actually, you just sent me a link.
That piece by Nick Wade in the Times.
Yeah, which was really interesting, and it would have been something I would have loved to have cited in my article in Spectrum because it's very relevant. And it's basically on these new findings about how the complexity, the structural complexity of synapses increases as you go from simple organisms up to more complex organisms,
right.
like from worms up to vertebrates and so forth. And so you get these synapses now that have as many as 1,000 different proteins assembled into 13 molecular machines, one of which is built from 183 different proteins.
Yeah, so in other words, it's not just there's already this huge number of densely connected neurons, but now we have this idea that, the synapses aren't just these little switches, but they're doing complex computations as well.
Right.
Which I think isn't, really a completely new idea, but...
Well, I guess it's sort of, people keep having to be reminded in various ways of just how complicated the brain is at all levels, and this tells us why it's been so difficult to create machines that can replicate the things that we do. And it also suggests that the whole sort of cyborg scenario of brains that are souped up with electronics will be much more difficult than we imagine.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a particularly good point that you made about the difficulty of these man-machine or people-machine interfaces. As for the complexity of the brain, one of the really exciting things to me about AI and why I ended up writing a book about it was this notion that you don't have to replicate the detailed, computation. You don't have to replicate the brain on the machine code level. That you can, skim off intelligence as, something that you can abstract into, like a higher level of rules or algorithms, and in that case, that wouldn't really be so much of a barrier. But again, it's a matter of figuring out the software, probably more than making these really powerful machines. And yet, a lot of the problems that when I wrote the book just seemed intractable that they were trying to solve by figuring them out computationally, by figuring out the algorithms and replicating them, like speech recognition, for example, and machine language translation. These just seemed impossibly intractable problems, and now we've made huge headway just by throwing huge amounts of computational power at them and, doing these basically statistical analyses of, I was really struck by a presentation I went to, I guess it was more than a year ago. It was some Google person was describing their machine translation work, and basically, instead of figuring out the rules for mapping one language onto another, they would just feed very powerful computers texts. And one was in Chinese and one was in English, translations of the same thing that they knew to be considered decent translations, and the machine would just would basically induce these statistical patterns, and there's probably nothing inside this network of connections that the machine was able to produce that you could point to as a rule and articulate, and yet it would be able to develop this ability to map one language onto the other.
So the the great question has been whether you can create a machine that can. I mean, that's actually an amazing feat. Machine translation. Is
and without
something
understanding at all how the brain understands language.
Right, but then the question is whether you can design a machine. So you can imagine a machine that can basically read any text in the world in any possible language, and then extract meaning from it and learn from it, and have a body of experience from which it draws general rules and principles. And that's a machine that you would have to say is intelligent. And it could even then become curious about certain things based on what it's already learned and sort of go off in new directions and do its own research. And this is actually a project that Doug Lennett at the University of Texas has been involved in for decades.
Yeah, CYC.
Psych. Yeah. And he's been promising. So the idea was that it would be a machine that would learn on its own and would acquire the kind of generalized knowledge about the world that makes humans intelligent insofar as we are intelligent, and would give it a kind of common sense. And it's just never happened. It just
but it's going to, obviously it's going to take a while.
Except that he was. The reason that I bring up Psych is because this is one of the great examples of all these predictions that one after another fell by the wayside. So Lennett originally in the 80s was claiming that by the mid-90s Psych would be able to start learning on its own, and that it was going to be by the year 2000. So he keeps
these timelines always have to be taken with a great deal of skepticism, but I think the main purpose is just to generate enthusiasm and to get the funding so you can try to do it, and then if you can't, you've at least made headway toward the problem.
I think some of these people, they really believe this stuff, though. So
but there's no reason in principle why why this singularity thing couldn't happen. Let me make sure we're talking about the same thing. I mean, the singularity is the point where machines become so powerful that they bootstrap their own machine intelligence or computational power, whatever you want to call it, to make more powerful machines that we couldn't make on our own. And at some point, these surpass human intelligence to the point where we either merge with, or I guess we have the opportunity to merge with them somehow and get some kind of immortality.
Yeah, that's the classic version. Then it's gotten more complicated.
I mean, that immortality thing, I don't, that's getting beyond what I think is science into science fiction. But the idea of increasingly more intelligent machines kind of bootstrapping themselves to higher levels, seems like something that's
inevitable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's the time frame.
Yeah.
I think what's almost a more interesting question to me isn't the issue of intelligence, because obviously computers are, by some measures, becoming more and more intelligent all the time. I mean, I'm just astonished with what you can do with Google, and some of the search programs are incredibly sophisticated. But the question is, what would it take for computers to sort of develop their own set of desires?
You'd have to have some kind of homeostatic, like yearnings, but that goes back to cybernetics, where there would be something programmed into the computer that would make it strive to make more connections between information that it acquired for its database, and then that would drive it to something we might call curiosity, to seek more information because it gets some sort of electronic equivalent of a dopamine reward, when it learns new things or finds new patterns.
So would that be its goal, acquiring knowledge? I mean, this sort of goes back to the question
if you wanted
I
to make it that way. But you could say, in some ways, a lot of what you're saying about computers becoming seemingly more intelligent is, in a lot of ways, it's just showing us that so many of the things we pride ourselves into as humans and think are, related to some mysterious, mental abilities are to the fact that we're conscious beings are actually pretty mechanical and can be fairly easily replicated or simulated by a machine, but that, of course, it still leaves the core sense of subjectivity in the whole question of whether these machines would have that.
Well, it's still, I guess this goes back to the question that I was hoping would be answered in that book, Year Million.
Yeah.
What would a super intelligent entity with basically, oh, not this again.
You must have more than one phone line.
I've got too many little phone-related devices on my desk here. This is driving me
it's
crazy.
Horrible,
my last
isn't it?
chat.
Yeah.
And the calls came in, and I didn't know how to turn them off.
Yeah.
But anyway, it still, to me, leaves unanswered this question of what these things would want to do. And these are theological questions to an extent.
Yeah.
These machines, let's say you do have these super intelligent machines, they wouldn't have all the frailties, the physical frailties that we have. They could quickly create what would look from the outside, from our perspective, like a utopia. They could eliminate all kinds of, any kind of mental anguish and physical anguish. But then,
why wouldn't they have mental anguish, though?
Well, I mean, why not just, if we were just talking about the possibility of programming your own set of desires and intentions.
Yeah.
So if you can do that, why not just program yourself so you just
but certain things that you don't program in would emerge as a byproduct. So you could have these. I can't believe we're seriously talking about this. I mean.
Well, this is the realm of, I think this is what this
here we are,
field
two
is
grown
really...
men sitting here talking about these machines becoming, having desires and creating utopias, but it's fun.
It is fun.
But I'm not sure it's anything more than fun.
It's scientific theology. That's what I like to call it.
It's intellectual entertainment, I think, more than...
I mean, so one of the questions is...
Well, what's theological about it?
Well, because I think you're trying to imagine heaven.
Okay,
that was one of the that was one of the themes that emerged in Year Million. If you've got an omniscient, omnipotent machine, what would it do? And the threat of boredom kept creeping into these essays. These people were having once you get past the Darwinian phase of just making more copies of yourself and relentlessly expanding and colonizing the entire universe. Well, you've done all that. Then what do you do?
Been there, done that.
Yeah. I think the only question would be, actually I wrote about this in The End of Science, is that you obsessively try to figure out where you came from. You try to figure out what the origin of the universe was, what your own origin was.
Yeah. You should really watch Battlestar Galactica, because it's really, it plays on some of these themes in what I think is a really, really, really very well done manner.
I should.
Yeah, I think you might like it.
Well, so should we...
Yeah, I guess, what's the bottom line here? It's people trying to find heaven through science, or is that your...
I think so. Yeah. I mean, that was how I concluded the Spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it's wonderful that people are, free to speculate about these things and can actually get big audiences, and that the public becomes excited by these ideas, and it gets them, interested in science. But I guess you're saying the danger is, people mistaking, science for science fiction, and the fact that, anything you can imagine isn't necessarily going to be true. I think Steven Pinker said something like that in that Spectrum issue. And
I guess it's because...
It's ironic science.
It's ironic science. I mean, we've got this great clash between science and religion going on now, and I think it's important to recognize when science itself leads to what aren't strictly rational beliefs. And so I like pointing out where I think science is venturing beyond what can be justified empirically.
Yeah.
And I think the singularity is a very good example of that. But it is fascinating stuff. I love talking to them.
Yeah, and the spectrum issue was good because it had, just as many scientists that were saying, well, how do we know it's not going to be hell on earth, so
right.
That kind of takes the religious component out of it, in which case you're just talking about the possibility of getting exponential increase in technology, and there was even a very good piece that someone had in the spectrum issue that was countering that possibility that technological improvement is going to happen anything like exponentially. So,
I don't know if you noticed that they had a little snippets of commentary from a lot of famous people, and they had one from Gordon Moore of all people.
Oh yeah, the Moore's Law Moore. Yeah.
Yeah, saying that he doesn't think the singularity would ever happen.
Yeah.
But then he actually
people like
says,
Doug Hofstadter saying basically, machines will become conscious, but it might happen someday, he says, but I think life and intelligence are far more complex than the current singularitarians seem to believe, so I doubt it will happen in the next couple of centuries.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, my kind of take on it. It's not inconceivable. That's a term that I used to learn when I was being interviewed for my science fiction, my artificial intelligence book. 2 decades ago, and I was actually interviewed by the National Enquirer. So I thought, well, what the hell? A lot of people read the National Enquirer, so they'd ask me questions about, computers becoming conscious and keeping us as pets, and I'd say, well, it's not inconceivable that such a thing would happen.
God, you have such wonderful twists and turns in your career. I'm so envious. Interviewed by Roseanne Barr.
Yeah, Roseanne Barr, yeah.
And now you tell me you're interviewed by, and, of course, Colbert Report.
The Stephen Colbert Report, getting to electrocute Stephen Colbert on air.
Yeah. And the National Enquirer. God, George. What a fun career you have.
I actually had a friend who was an editor there who had been at the Miami Herald, and he got laid off. And he just decided, to hell with this. So he went to Lantana, where I think the National Enquirer is, and got a job and sold out big time.
Uh-huh. and had plenty of fun. Instead of taking all this journalism crap so seriously.
Yeah.
Hey, so...
so what else have you been thinking about lately?
Well, I saw that maybe we can start talking about economics. I saw that in last Sunday's New York Times book review, you had you reviewed a book that I've heard about recently.
Oh, yeah.
Drunkard's Walk.
Yeah.
So
Leonard Mlodinow. Yeah, it's a really neat book. It's I think I said in the review that after reading it, I thought I finally understood the famous Monty Hall problem.
Uh-huh.
And,
which is,
yeah.
Do you want to take that on?
Well, maybe we should. Let's see. I'll need to find my review to remind me of the details.
It's one of these seemingly simple mathematical puzzles that's actually made a fool of some of the great mathematical minds of our time.
Yeah, including Paul Erdős, who just found it baffling, or so it says in Bruce Schechter's biography of Erdős. Okay, let's see.
Yeah, I think Marilyn Vos-Savant
had
a poem on it in Parade magazine.
Yeah, that's when it really
ago.
became popular. And then John Tierney, my colleague at the Times, wrote a piece about it. He's kind of become the it's really his journalistic territory. He actually went out to Hollywood or Beverly Hills and played the game. Let's Make a Deal game with Monty Hall.
Is that right?
Yeah. But we should back up and say what it is. So I'll just paraphrase my review. So it's named for this old TV game show called Let's Make a Deal. So you are presented with 3 doors, behind one of which is a new car. So you pick your door, but before your fate is revealed, before you see if you pick the right door, Monty Hall swings open one of the other doors, and it reveals that one's empty, or there's a booby prize or something. So far so good. Now you know that you have one of the 2 doors left that must have the prize. So the decision you're supposed to make then is, do you stay, and Monty Hall gives you a choice. He says, do you want to stick with your original choice, or do you want to switch to the other unopened door? Now, what would your...
I'm just trying to remember how this went in that Maryland was.
But it seems obvious that it wouldn't matter, right? That
well,
it
yeah,
would
it
be
seems
50-50 proposition.
Right, and that's what even mathematicians.
Even Paul Erdős. It just seems obvious that it's got to be 50-50.
Yeah,
but then
somehow having the one door revealed after you'd made your initial choice changes the odds.
Yeah, it changes the odds because, for one thing, Monty Hall's not going to open the door with the prize. I mean, he knows, of course, where the car is, so he's going to open... He's not opening a door at random. He's opening the door, one of the two doors where the prize is not. So, he's not going to ruin the game. So basically, he skews the odds by revealing this additional information.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as a result, it ends up... it is to your advantage, then, to switch doors, and most of the time, if you switch doors, you'll win.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a
big... Wait, I thought I understood this when I wrote the review, and it's already eluded me again.
Oh, this is like explaining the two-slit experiment in quantum mechanics, which has messed me up a number of times.
Yeah, this is even harder, I think. Yeah, but anyway, I don't want to get into this too deeply since I can't, immediately remember how to explain it. But I would refer people to Mladenov's chapter in his book, The Drunkard's Walk, because he explained it really clearly, I thought.
Well, so I gather that
I'm going to go find the book. Yeah, I don't know what now?
I gather that the theme of the book is that randomness is pervasive through nature and society and
the illusion of having
right?
way more control generally than we really do.
So Drunkard's Walk sounds very much like Random Walk. So does he talk about randomness in the stock market? Is he a random walk?
No, he talks a little bit about that. Yeah, but it's really just goes all over the map. There's a lot of that Kahneman and Tversky stuff, about how people, just basically intuitively make decisions in a manner that doesn't really comport with the mathematical odds, and has some speculation on evolutionary reasons for that. And it's a very funny, kind of lightly written book too. It's been, it was a couple of months ago that I actually reviewed it, and then it was kind of sitting in the queue for a while.
Well, so does it address the question? So you and I both have done a lot of writing about and hanging out with people at the Santa Fe Institute involved in studying complex phenomena, and the hope was that certain complex behaviors, say the movement of stock markets, which appear noisy on the surface, would turn out to have a certain deterministic order that you could discover by using new mathematical techniques and
that they may be chaotic, and that the exponential amplification of the small butterfly wing effects, but that still you could conceivably find some deterministic. I mean, it is deterministic. It's called deterministic chaos. So even though it seems chaotic and random, there's an underlying pattern that you could conceivably tease out.
So did you get a sense from?
No, he didn't get into that so much.
Okay.
But the reason I'm kind of stuttering here, I was trying to quickly read through his explanation of the Monty Hall problem and see. It's on page 54.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, maybe I'll just go into that. It's kind of a diversion here, but okay. So,
meanwhile, I'm scratching my back with a back scratcher.
Oh, okay, good. So we'll keep this loose. So there's two possibilities now as you're trying to make your decision on the Monty Hall problem. The first is the possibility that your initial choice was correct.
Mm-hmm.
So then obviously you don't know this, but your initial choice is correct, and the host will now randomly open either door 2 or door 3, because, neither of them contain the car, so we can open one or the other. And if you choose to switch, then you're obviously going to lose. So this is what he calls the lucky guess scenario. You guessed right the first time, so you're better off not switching. But he goes on to show that the chance that you landed in this situation is only 1 in 3. Mm-hmm. So two times out of 3, it's going to be the case that you chose one of the doors that's empty and that doesn't have the car. So 2 out of 3 of the times, the car is going to be under one of the doors inside one of the doors you didn't choose, so you're going to be better off if you switch. So it's not 50-50, because 2/3 of the time you'll be in a case where it's better to switch, and 1/3 of the time you'll be in a situation where it's better to hang tight.
I wonder if they...
There's actually a great simulation that Ken Chang at Science Times put together for one of John Tierney's recent pieces on this, in which you can play the Monty Hall game online, and you do it, and you keep track of your odds, and you notice that, sure enough, 2 out of 3 times you're better off switching.
Uh-huh.
I still find it just astonishing, and so do a lot of people who sent me email about the article that I still need to answer.
Well, the reason I keep asking these questions about economics is because over the last month or so, I've had some economics encounters. In fact, just yesterday, I had lunch with a fan of our show, George, an economist, a Swedish economist named Christopher Niemark, who is a visiting professor at NYU, wrote me an email and said he liked the show and just wanted to get together. So we had lunch at a nice little place down in the village yesterday and talked about economics. And as far as I could tell, Christopher is a random walk guy who thinks that it's really impossible to consistently beat the system without insider trading or
I mean, that's my gut feeling, but I haven't thought about it enough that I'd call it more than a gut feeling. I did read Burton Malkiel's book years ago.
Yeah, me too. And I think that's sort of I think that's a good principle to guide you if you're just some schmuck like me trying to make money in the market. But I went to a meeting at a place called James Madison University last month on economic complexity. It was organized by a guy named Barclay Rosser, a friend of a friend, who was very enamored of Santa Fe Institute style complexity studies, particularly as applied to economics. Mm-hmm. And
that's great stuff.
He invited me to this meeting to be the respondent because he knew I had said all these nasty things about the Santa Fe Institute and the work that they were doing. And it turned out to be really interesting. So they had people who were trying to apply techniques from physics to economics, so that's called econophysics.
Econophysics, yeah. There's some fascinating stuff going on in that.
And there are people also trying to apply biological models to economics of Darwinian and other types of biological approaches. Yeah. And then some work in cellular automata, the sort of autonomous agents, and you put a bunch of them together and you get extraordinarily complex behavior.
Yeah, like they do these simulated markets where they have little artificial agents that are bidding against each other for resources.
Yeah, actually there was a really interesting presentation by a guy, gosh, I can't remember his name, but people could probably find it if they Google it. He was a British economist. I think he's working in France now. And he presented a model on how even a slight preference to live among people of your own color or kind can lead to total segregation in housing markets. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is interesting and has real practical...
So you get a lock-in effect. And
yeah.
It sounds like some of that stuff, where Brian Arthur, positive returns theory, which isn't so positive in that case, but positive in just in a very abstract sense of getting positive feedback. So you get a slight little difference, like between Microsoft Windows and the Apple Macintosh operating system, and the slight difference gets amplified beyond all reason, and it's really based, not on any kind of rational decisions. Or the Sony Betamax VHS format versus the VHS format's another one that is often used as an example. So the same kind of lock-in effects could happen with housing.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of that, and overall the meeting was it was really interesting and sort of fun to be there because the approaches were all so diverse. The sorts of problems people were looking at were very wide-ranging, but I still ended up being very skeptical. They'd scaled the rhetoric back, so you didn't have people saying that social science and economics were going to be as rigorous and precise and predictive as nuclear physics, which is what some people were kind of saying back in the early 90s in the heyday of complexity studies. So I started thinking of it as more, if they could view this whole field as engineering rather than science, and use these models for solving particular problems in the real world. But there, going back to Random Walk, one of the people who struck me as being really almost scary smart there was a guy. I think he'd started out as a physicist and then ended up working for a French hedge fund, and he presented a model that he said could reliably beat the market by exploiting tiny temporary inefficiencies.
Right. Well, yeah. No, that's exactly what. That's what my friend Owen Farmer and Norman Packard, did with the prediction company.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of what I've read about what.
Yeah, because the market, in theory, it's 100% efficient, so that information becomes immediately dissipated, so that any information about a company is going to be discounted in the price. Right? That's basically Burton Malkiel, and therefore the fluctuations in a market that happen beyond that are a random walk, and some people will luck out. Like every year, a certain number of brokers will be very lucky, and a certain number of them, the vast majority of them will be unlucky, and the lucky ones will be clever, congratulated on their cleverness. And yeah, Mlodinow actually does write quite a bit about that in the book. Now that I think about it, and
well, with this guy said. So I confronted him afterwards, and I said, "Come on, the smartest people in the world, Nobel laureates, lose their shirts in the market. It's all random walk. It comes to luck." And he said, "No, you're wrong." He said, "Our models, we have tremendous returns using these models.
Yeah.
It works very reliably." He says that He says it only works for a while, so they have to.
Right.
Inevitably, the model itself becomes it sort of seeps into the market. The market somehow learns how the model performs.
Right,
it
becomes discounted. Yeah.
That's right. And so then they have to keep inventing new models.
Right.
And they also have to.
No, this is exactly what Doan and Norman have told me about the basic ideas behind the prediction company, and it also remains, very successful. Both of these guys are wealthy as a result of this.
It's sort of from the philosophy of science point of view, what fascinates me about this is the idea that the economics model keeps changing the behavior of its object of study.
Right.
And so they have to keep modifying the model to take that into account. In this case, their goal is just to make money.
Yeah, playing the market, it's always been a matter of not, anticipating what will happen, but how people will perceive what will happen, and how they might perceive how you will perceive what they will perceive what will happen. So you've had this infinite hall of mirror effects.
Right. Well, you get it, on a even larger and more dramatic scale. If you have an economist like Karl Marx or Keynes their writing will change the world. They convert people to Marxism or
Keynesianism, yeah,
and dramatically change the behavior of the system.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, so astronomers study planets or even quarks and things like that, and our models don't change the behavior, unless you're talking about some kind of, I know people are going to...
the quantum
effects.
Yeah.
But, not anything as dramatic as what we're talking about in social science and economics.
Yeah. No, I mean, just by studying it, and especially if you study it and find some little information inefficiency that you can exploit with a model to make, just a slight little margin on transactions. I mean, it doesn't matter how little it is. If you can do it, with hundreds of millions of dollars, you accumulate a lot of profits. But then, just the fact that you're doing this changes the nature of the market, and someone else can figure out a rule based on that'll last for a little while, and it's just fascinating.
It is. Economics is a really paradoxical field because in some sense it's really weak. It's always sort of one step behind what it's studying, in part because of this effect we're talking about.
Wasn't there some good quote from, was that in your blog about this, on the Stevens side, about the best that really happens is that the quality of our disagreements becomes...
Oh, that was a quote I had from Clifford Geertz.
Clifford Geertz about anthropology, right? What was that again? That was a great quote.
Yeah, it was. It was. If I can recall it, it was what gets better is the precision with which we vex each other.
Yeah, right, right. So, in the same with economics. That.
Well, yeah, except that I guess economics has the potential to do enormous harm, but also great good in the world. So I just finished last week reading The End of Poverty by the Columbia economist Jeffrey Sachs. And in some ways it's a very humble, it's a grandiose title, but a very humble, practically oriented book. And he says that he started out with sort of grand principles and visions of economics in mind, and then he realized that to do good in the world, you had to try to solve problems in their context. So if you're trying to solve hyperinflation in Peru in the 1990s, what you've learned from hyperinflation in Germany in the early 1930s won't necessarily help you at all.
Yeah.
That problems are very contingent and contextual and so forth, and yet if you do have that sensitivity to local conditions. And again, this is sort of science as it's really engineering.
Yeah.
It's problem solving rather than discovering truth.
Yeah.
But then you can do enormous good. And I think Jeffrey Sachs is, his approach to reducing misery in the world and extreme poverty is, I think it's really had a lot of good already, and I expect it to continue reducing the amount of poverty around the world. But in part because he's kind of humble in how he approaches it.
Well, do you think some of these, like to me, this econophysics is fascinating, and the thought that you could use your understanding of condensed matter systems or solid state physics, where you're trying to get sort of a rough handle on different qualitative aspects of systems where you have many little actors interacting in simple ways but producing complex behavior. So this happens in physics, it happens in economics, so why not apply models that we know will explain things like superconductivity or phase changes in physics to economies which undergo phase changes. So I guess one thing that I wonder about is if these models, if they're only going to be used so that people like the guy that works for the French hedge fund that you were describing can make lots of money for themselves and their investors, or if there's some way these models can lead to understandings in situations like Sachs is describing in his book, where it actually might do some good for people who are on the bottom rungs of society.
Well, yeah, or maybe they could be related. If one of these people make all their billions, and then, like Bill Gates, they decide to try to put some of it back. And,
right. Yeah, so just the old philanthropy model, except you're doing it with money you base. You get on these very complex economic models that obviously can go awry, as we've seen recently with the mortgage situation. But
well, what this French guy said that, I said, because I remember I read about the prediction company, and they said that one of the difficulties early on was trusting their models and letting them run and not interfering them and hand tweaking them and so forth. And I asked this guy about that. I said, to what extent do you just let your models run? And he said, we can never just let them run. We're constantly supervising them because there are always things that can happen in the real world that they can't be anticipated within the model.
Right,
the model can't deal with. Whether it's
an earthquake in China,
exactly those sorts of things.
Yeah.
The model would be too complex if you try to incorporate all those uncertainties and variables into it. So he says we're always, it's a very hands-on type of thing. The model can work very well within certain parameters, but every now and then, economics is an open system, and
so you're constantly changing the context.
Right.
Then in which your algorithm is working, it sounds like.
So just to tie this back to artificial intelligence, it's this is one of the things that computers still are so bad at. They can be extremely intelligent within a very precisely defined domain, but they lack that ability to be aware of a larger context that might have a significant impact on what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and yet they're great at pattern recognition.
Yeah?
Well, they're getting greater and greater all the time, but...
Except Marvin Minsky, a couple of years ago, I mentioned this in my Spectrum article, said that you still don't have artificial vision systems that can reliably tell the difference between cats and dogs.
Yeah.
So that's just sort of a reality
I don't know.
check.
Just these things with, with what's happened, as I mentioned before, with machine language translation and speech recognition using these statistical throw a lot of computing power at it kind of approaches that really makes me think if you can pick up patterns like that with more computing power, applying that to the stock market and picking up these patterns that may be constantly changing, where you could only exploit one particular pattern for maybe one day or even a few seconds, within the ever-changing marketplace, that you could imagine being able to exploit those little market inefficiencies before they get discounted out of the system, and just do it more and more. But then, of course, if everyone's doing that and has equally powerful computers, it all comes out in the wash, doesn't it?
That's what this guy said. He said they have to keep looking for new markets where you don't have these kind of sophisticated programs working yet. And he said eventually, over time, the
saturation.
The margins become smaller and smaller as all this knowledge is increasingly embedded or more rapidly embedded into the system.
So that's the singularity.
So he said
approach this point where it'll all just be, the market, like mathematics, will just obviously be a big tautology. And it won't work anymore. Or will they just can they just keep infinitely bootstrapping it into more and more complex financial instruments? And
he seemed to think that ultimately they're facing the prospect of diminishing returns, which I guess is the economic version of heat death.
Wow, that's really interesting. Wow, so that'll be the collapse of civilization. And the question is whether this will become before the singularity, where we have the superintelligent androids that we merge our consciousness into them and get immortality, or whether we'll get this economic heat death before that happens. So we have these two trajectories toward different singularities and we're not sure where they will cross and what will be the ultimate singularity.
God, I've got to start taking better care of myself and adopting Ray Kurzweil's diet and vitamin regimen so I live long enough to see all this shit hit the fan.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Otherwise, it's it's kind of abstract, and I don't know that I care so much. I think I've used this quote before in Blogging Heads, but there's a great scene in one of the Woody Allen movies where they're talking about immortality and living forever through your children or through your artistic works and books that people continue to read. And then he says, no, it's not the kind of immortality I want. I want immortality where I live forever, me.
Yeah.
And if it's not that, it's less interesting.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Well, let's go out and exercise.
Yeah. Or get drunk, one or the other. Or both.
Oh, by the way, happy Friday the 13th.
Yeah, I thought we could have had a whole riff on superstition, but maybe we'll save that for the...
we can't let Friday the 13th stop us if we're going to be science writers.
No, I guess not. Although I think we're all fundamentally superstitious, we can't really escape that.
Yeah.
But that's a discussion for another time.
Yep, let's do it. Okay, John.
All right. Hey, it's great talking to you again, George.
You too.
All right, so
Okay.
long.